Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and this white tub that you see right behind me, it's nearing its final stages of being depopulated of worms. It was 12 days ago that we last checked in on this bin, and we actually hauled out what we estimated to be over 1,000 worms. And at that time we had set up the feeding zone of that bin to let that migration of worms out of the finished compost continue. And then down here on the lower shelf, below it, is the new bin that we started with those worms. So we're going to kind of repeat that same process today. We're going to be hauling more worms out of that container, which I've got a couple stats about it written down over here. The bin is now 133 days old. Counting that last feeding that the bin received 12 days ago, the bin has now been fed 17 times. And like I mentioned earlier, haul out number 1 of worms that happened 12 days ago happened after the bin had been fed 3 times in that horizontal migration feeding zone over the course of 17 days. And then the worms got hauled out. So a little different this time. Rather than waiting 17 days and replenishing that food supply in that migration zone a couple times, this time we just loaded up that feeding zone. We put some apples in there, some melons, a whole bunch of yummy stuff in there to try to help continue persuading the worms to come out of the finished compost and into the feeding area. And today, after 12 days, we're going to kind of hope to see that the finished castings may have been pretty heavily depopulated. Because even last time we were in here 12 days ago, we did already notice that all the way out here on the far edge, the edge that's opposite of the feeding zone, there were hardly any worms remaining at all. And as you can see, this is covered with only paper, allowing for the ongoing evaporation of the moisture and hopefully making the material dry enough and uncomfortable enough for the worms that they go looking for a more cozy place to be, which is over there in the feeding area on the opposite side, covered with plastic where the food is and the moisture is. So I didn't even bring food down here today. My hope was that maybe, just maybe, the finished castings have been depopulated and we can consider this bin as done after 133 days. But we'll only know after we get in here and check, so let's get these up on the bench and see how we're doing. Okay, so last time we only checked the finished casting area after we did our work to see how many worms remained. But I believe this time I'm going to start by checking the finished castings to see if, by chance, maybe the worms have actually all left. And then we'll know right away if our migration of the worms out of the finished castings was successful, or if we're going to have to reload the feeding zone to help this continue onward. What we see here is what remains, at least, of a coffee filter. Sometimes I just like to use coffee filters to indicate where I fed. Here it was quite clear where we last fed, but it's more of a kind of a traditional thing for me to be using those as a feeding zone indicator. And the plastic that was over there was really trying to help recirculate any moisture that might be trying to escape. And you can see it's much more damp over here. You can also see a bunch of deposited castings here. So now let's check this side out here. By being covered only by paper, the material on the very top surface is a little bit more dry than you would normally find in a worm bin, and that's kind of by design. My hope was that the worms would start to realize that this material over on this side was becoming rather dry, and that they should probably seek out another place to be. And as a result of that, a lot of this material simply gets neglected. So you see a lot of leafy matter, a lot of sticks and stems, stuff that's probably not going to get broken down unless it's surrounded by damp materials to make it soft and more approachable. So it's the stuff that I usually set aside and try to use when I rebuild the feeding zones. So should we come to the point where we feel that we're going to rebuild this to try to continue the migration of worms out of the material, we could use some of that uncomposted material to set up that feeding zone. This would be the bedding. and then we would just need some food, and I would bring down some food from my freezer. But I'm trying to remain optimistic in the hopes that maybe today's work is going to consist of nothing more than removing the worms out of the feeding area, and then considering this is a finished tub of castings that can simply be poured off into storage. Some people might even want to sift it through to make sure that all these larger particles don't remain in the material. As far as I'm concerned, this is perfect. I don't care. I don't mind having large materials in my finished compost. And even though the surface is rather dry, you don't have to dig down very deep. Right away you could feel the nice, cool, damp material. And, well, I mean, I was getting all hopeful, thinking that I've not yet seen a worm, and I do see one little itsy-bitsy worm right there on the tip of my finger. We'll put them over in the feeding area. But considering we're so close to the feeding area, we are doing pretty good in terms of seeing so few worms so far. So maybe I've just come in a little bit too close to the feeding area. Let's see what else we see if we keep probing down. I'm still catching the glimpse of a worm here and there. So let's just go straight to the bottom and see what we see where the most damp material is. So that's pretty promising too, I must say. Here again, another straggler, a couple stragglers. Oh, that one got away from me. Oh, got him. A couple stragglers still working the very edge of the feeding area. So, I mean, I'm not trying to start a new pattern here of picking out every worm that I spot, but I sometimes just can't resist. I get caught up. But I mean, in the past, I've definitely considered the material, even with a few worms in it, to be finished compost. So, you know, if I do end up considering this is done, I would probably be doing so with the knowledge that it's going to include a few straggler worms in it and probably a whole bunch of worm cocoons as well, all with the potential of hatching and creating even more worms. But I don't worry too much about that, because I always know for sure that this material is probably still riddled with edible foods. And I've also heard that the worms can actually re-ingest their castings over and over, I think half a dozen or more times, and they would be able to just continue to use their castings as nourishment if that were all they had. So I'm still kind of torn here. My assumption here is that if I can continue to look in this direction, we would find castings only, and that does seem to be the case so far. So now I've gone ahead and I grabbed this piece of paper that we were using to cover up with, because I'm going to grab all this stuff that we skimmed off the top. I'm just going to set it aside here on the paper. Because if in fact we are going to consider all of this material on this side that I'm working on as all finished castings, then I would like this stuff right here, all these unbroken down bits of scraps, to go with the worms into their new locations. So I'm going to pull this off just in case we are actually going to consider this as finished castings. And I'm really leaning towards that at this point because I like what I see here. The material has got just the right moisture level. It's nice and cool and damp. And there's definitely worms hanging out in it. Not many. Nothing like we saw last time we checked in here. Last time, which was 12 days ago, we saw worms cruising around when we dug around in this general area, and we're still finding some, so I'm starting to wonder if I really want to consider this as done, or do I want to continue a little bit longer and just give the worms a little bit more time to make their way out. And, you know, I look all over the place and I see worm cocoons all over the place. I'm not sure if it's visible, but it's right there on top of that little fragment that I pulled out. So there might still be some potential of baby worms hatching into this material too, and then, you know, maybe wanting to give those worms extra time to work their way out of the castings. You know, I've done that before in the past, not too long ago, and I always feel like I just go down this really, really long road of waiting and waiting for hatchlings to emerge, and then waiting for them to depopulate the material. And in the end, I just feel like I've, taken a great deal of time to allow for the exit of very few worms in the end. It just seems like very few of them ever get collected after that's allowed to occur. And ultimately the material itself, the castings, are no better for it. And I could have just considered that material as done and put it aside, worms and all. Probably not many worms, but worms and all. And those worms would continue to work down that material, making it even into a finer product in the end. And then once the material does get used out in the garden would also benefit from those worms being out there too. And my worm population would certainly not be detrimented by the absence of those few worms, either the ones that slip through the process or ones that are actually born within the finished compost. So I'm obviously trying to talk myself into calling this bin as done. You can probably tell. So at this point, I think I'm really just working towards that by skimming off more and more of what's here, so I can consider all of this as just finished compost to be put into storage versus being relocated with the worms. Because I'd like for this to be, primarily worms rather than just a whole bunch of castings being hauled over into the new bin. But it really doesn't matter so much. I think the main reason is that I just want to be able to better see how many worms we've been left with in the end. And it's always easiest to see them if they're separated from the castings that they're inhabiting. So I'm going to see how far I can go here in terms of pushing over stuff that appears to be mainly finished castings. And maybe while we do it, we gently convince the worms on the very edge to burrow down deeper into the pile to stay with the rest of their aunts and uncles and cousins and sisters and brothers. But this looks really nice. Very nice material over here. I'm sure it helped that I was using a lot of that uncomposted stuff I skimmed off the top. That's the same thing I did last time, was I skimmed all that stuff off the top, and then I rebuilt the feeding area with that stuff. Stuff that had been sitting in the bins for quite some time, was pretty heavily broken down already, and by being surrounded by foods and stuff like that, it really helped it all get broken down nicely. And then I wasn't left with all kinds of uncomposted bedding bits and stuff like that too. It was all stuff that was probably very close to being broken down anyway. So I'm trying to decide, where do I cut it off? This stuff is all still kind of loose and flaky and not too populated with worms. It seems like I can keep going here a little further. Stuff gets a little bit more clumpy and wet down near the bottom. And it's funny too, because as I nudge it all around that way, the way I was just nudging it, I can hear kind of moisture and stuff squishing around here and there. And I guess it could partially be the food that's in here still, leftover food pieces, squishing and making noise, but my hope is that that noise is actually the sound of worms being squished here and there. And that would tell us that we've got a good haul of worms in here. And I'm starting to get the sense that we probably do have a pretty good haul of worms in here. And I gotta say, I'm really pleased that it only took 2 migrations, one of 17 days and a second one of only 12 days, to be able to depopulate this many castings. So I don't always have that sort of luck. Sometimes it takes far longer, but I guess it was just the right set of circumstances and environmental conditions that, worked in our favor this time. So all in all, that leaves us with a 29-day migration of the worms out of the castings. So basically a month to make it happen, which ain't bad at all. Now I'm definitely starting to feel this material is pretty gooey and wet. So I think I'm actually hitting up against the food that was placed in here most recently. I was growing concerned that maybe the food that I had placed in here had already been depleted and that I was shooting myself in the foot by not replenishing the food to keep this migration going. But it seems like we probably took the majority of the worms out in the first haul, and this is really just the balance. So I'm trying to think of what to do here. I'd love to leave more and more castings behind if I could, but so much of it I'm noticing is going to be littered with food fragments that maybe at this point it is just best to take everything that remains and bring it with the worms over into their new home. And then I'll have to make some room in one of my buckets to put all this stuff into. But that's not the interesting part. What we're here to see is this stuff right here, right? So let's get these babies out of here. I'm going to put them into this this plastic tub that I've got. But I don't want to rest them right here on top of the casting, so I'll level things off a little bit and put this coffee filter down underneath here to try to keep things clean. And let's begin with the excavation of these worms. I wonder how many we ended up with here. It would be nice to try to estimate, because the worms, each time I go to relocate them, I do make an attempt to estimate how many I've hauled out. And sometimes I put it on the scale, but when there's this much extra material alongside them, the food and the bedding and the castings and everything else, I don't feel that weighing them is going to produce a very reliable piece of information. So I do try to estimate how many worms there are, but I think it'll be more of a visual estimate, just to say, hey, I think just from looking at it, we've probably got X amount of worms. And this is when I'll usually turn to the audience to see if they would, be so kind as to provide me with their estimates of how many worms they think we've hauled out here. So please watch closely, and please let me know what you think in terms of how many worms we've got here. You can see I've got a handful, which I can feel squirming in my hand, and there's definitely some castings here too. But I would have to say that the majority of it is worms, as you can see right there. And here and there, there's like the stem of a banana, all kinds of stuff that was part of their feeding when we had set up this migration zone last time, 12 days ago. So I'm almost thinking that in addition to adding worms to the newest of my bins, which is where we're going to be releasing these little guys, I can also almost consider this as a feeding for that bin, which would actually be the first feeding for that bin. Because there is a pretty good amount of food remaining in here. Look at all that. I gotta say, this container has definitely got some nice weight to it. I'm not sure how much of it is castings, how much of it is worms, but it's definitely got some serious weight. There's a couple more worms straggling over here in this remaining little pile of castings, but I would almost consider this as just castings only at this point. Like I said, I don't mind having worms in my castings. To me, it just seems like they're going to continue breaking the material down, and I'll just end up with much better castings in the end. All right. A lot of moisture collected into this coffee filter while it was sitting there on the side. So that's it. I'm going to consider this as a done bin after 133 days. This bin is ready to be harvested. And by harvesting, I simply mean pouring this into one of my storage buckets. There's really not much to see there, and I'll probably take care of that off camera. But before we finish today, we're going to release these worms that we collected into the newest of my bins. So let's get to that now. So, like I mentioned earlier, the last haul of worms that we did out of that tub was 12 days ago. was with those worms that we launched off this new bin 12 days ago. And, you know, there's something weird going on in here. I don't know what it is, but you can probably see a couple of these gnats or fruit flies or whatever they are buzzing around. And I'm wondering if having this plastic on top of the bin is the reason. We're also going to remove these pieces of paper bag, I believe they are, or similar material to paper bag. I just don't want to take worms along for the ride. This material is a little bit damp and might remain comfortably damp for them long enough that it wouldn't cause them harm. My main concern is that they might crawl off onto the table, and if I don't catch them in time, they would potentially perish in the dry environment. So I don't know, maybe I'll just fold it up like this so that if there are worms, they've got a nice damp area to burrow into or to remain in until we're done here. And we'll cover up with this sort of damp piece of paper. So at least this way I feel like the worms are relatively safe. This material is mainly bedding at this point. That's the reason I like to cover up with plastic in the beginning, is because there's not a lot of moisture in the bin. The main moisture source is the food that had been placed into this bin throughout the bin in various locations. Even though you normally see me feed down the middle when I build a bin, I place food all around the bin. So all that material, as it's breaking down, is emitting moisture, and the plastic is really there to catch that moisture and prevent it from just evaporating away. And that ends up making all this bedding nice and damp and cozy, and it makes the entire bin such that the worms can feel comfortable going just about anywhere in the bin. Although I'm starting to wonder if I want to maybe use some other sort of plastic covering at this point. Maybe the fact that it's attached to that piece of cardboard is allowing enough room for the little flying insects to get underneath it. So maybe if it was just resting right on top, laying across the top, then it would be less of a little haven for these little flying insects. So I'm always trying to figure out what I'm doing wrong when I start seeing flying insects. But it's funny because the flying insects were really causing a little bit of a stir in another of my containers where they seem to have vanished. It's starting to look like they might have moved into here. Terrific. Okay, so I've got worms to place in here. However, I'd also like to place all of this unfinished material that we skimmed off the top of that other container, as well as that gobbled up piece of coffee filter that was in there as a feeding zone indicator. So we'll just place this down here as the platform onto which we can place our new addition of worms. And this will be the last chance we get to look at them, so this will be the last chance to try to estimate their numbers. So I'd love to hear what people think in terms of how many worms we're releasing in here today. Let's bring them in. You can see that they burrowed down. None of them are visible here because of the bright lights overhead. And that's understandable, but hopefully that means that they're on the bottom side, so once we flip this whole thing upside down, we'll have a good view of them to maybe get a better sense of how many we've got. So let's get them released, and let's also see if we can come up with an estimate of how many we've released here. Okay, only a couple stuck behind. So let's get this thing spread out a little bit, make their retreat down into the bin a little bit easier, giving more and more of them access to more and more of the material straight below them. So I would definitely have to say there's at least a few hundred in here. I'm not sure if I could say there's 1,000. 1,000 may be a bit high, but I'd love to hear what you think. Put it in the comments if you have an estimate of how many worms you think you see here. So let's let these little guys get comfortable, and let's let them retreat down into the bedding. Alright, I've given this bin maybe, I don't know, 6-8 minutes for the worms to retreat down into the material. And I think I might still see one or two hanging out. But for the most part, they've all dove down into the bin. And that also, to me, is kind of an indicator of how many worms we've got. Because when I've got a lot of worms, it does seem like it takes a long time for them to kind of make their way down. Some of them at the very bottom of the pile might not even see the light, so they don't even know to retreat. So all the ones that are above them are trying to squirm past them and everything like that. But here it seems like these little guys retreated down into the material quite quickly. So I'm starting to come up with maybe an estimate of maybe, I don't know, what do you think, 700-800 worms in here or so? That's kind of where my guess is at. So I'd love to hear what other people think. So please put it in the comments if you have an idea of how many worms were just released here. And you can see banana peel. There's different peels of different types of fruit left in here. Maybe apple. I guess some of the apple that was placed in here might not have been fully eaten yet. So I think there's a pretty good amount of food coming along with these worms. So I'm definitely going to count this as a feeding for this bin. That's actually the bin's second feeding based on the way I keep track, because the material that was placed in here as food when I originally built the bin, I always count the fresh bin as already having its first feeding. So in my record keeping, this goes in as feeding number 2, technically. So, all right, that's kind of where we stand. Let me start putting things back together here. I'm going to just go ahead and use this as my indicator to show where we last fed. It was more or less down the middle in this case. And then I guess we can start bringing some of these pieces of paper back that were covering up the material. Let's see how this all plays out. You can already see that they were starting to gobble their way through that piece of paper, which happens when it's right there on the surface. All that moisture collecting on the plastic and condensing and becoming available for the worms right there at the surface brings them up. So while they're enjoying the moisture, they also tend to take a little nibble at the cardboard too while they're there. So I can already see some worms that are hanging out right here on the on the plastic sheet that's covering this cardboard. And I can see some mites. Huh. Well, you know, I mean, I usually like having the plastic attached to a piece of cardboard this way to make it a lot more manageable, easier to handle. But I'm wondering if I might be better off, at least in this case, with something that actually has the ability to rest right up against the surface so that there's no crawl space, if you will, beneath this and the material right below it. Because maybe that's exactly why the flying insects are attracted to this, and they're finding themselves a nice little place to hide underneath here. Or maybe I just need to trim the edges of this a little bit so that it doesn't pin up against the walls of the bin and remain suspended above the material. So I'll solve that later. For now, this will do. So we're done. And that makes it official. That's one less active bin in my wormery. And now I'm going to estimate that based on previous estimates of what went into the bin last time, which we thought was something in the neighborhood of 1,200 worms. And if we combine that with my estimate of maybe another 800 worms here, that brings us to a fairly round number. Let's say 2,000 worms in this bin, which ain't bad. A little bit less than what my other bins are operating with. But that's fine. I've actually been thinking of reducing my numbers in some of those really heavily populated bins anyway. So I think this is a pretty good example of where the typical worm bin would typically want to be after it gets launched or soon after it gets launched. All right, everyone. Let me get things cleaned up around here and put away, but that's boring. I won't take your time with that. Before I go, let me just say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your company, and if you enjoyed the video, I hope you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.